without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Asada Thomas. Asada Thomas, how are you?
I'm well, Kyle. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Good. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful day. It is indeed my pleasure to be able to present this webinar today. So thank you for your patience, and let's get started. So the title is The Effects of Mass Incarceration on Communities of Color, specifically the consequences of these health-related issues. And so before we get started talking about the specifics of the health-related issues, I just want to do a general overview of mass incarceration. And as you know that the United States has 5% of the world's population, but nearly 25% of its incarcerated population. And we continue to imprison more people than any other nation in the world. And obviously this was largely due to the war on drugs. These misguided drug laws, including the three strikes and harsh sentencing requirements, have produced such profoundly unequal outcomes for persons of color. And although rates of drug use and sales are similar across racial and ethnic lines, Black and Latino people are far more likely to be criminalized than white persons. And even if we take that a step further, with the legalization now of marijuana, white men are benefiting from the sale of marijuana, wherein Black persons were incarcerated and are still being incarcerated for this sale. So the cycle continues of this disproportionate persons of color being incarcerated. This is just a graph, thanks to the Pew Research Center, of showing the U.S. and how we indeed incarcerate a larger share of our population than any other country. And if you look, for instance, at Russia, and their number is 415, and just over the entirety of the map, we continue to be at this increased number of persons that are incarcerated. Right now, we are at 2.3 million people that are incarcerated, 93% men and 7% women. And the women are, although the number is less, the percentage is less, they're growing at a quicker rate than men, which is at a rate of 50%. Women are currently being incarcerated. And some 6.7 million Americans are under some form of criminal supervision. And to bring it a little closer to home, for those of us in Philadelphia, we have the highest per capita incarceration rate of the 10 largest cities in the nation. That's profound. 32,000 persons go through the Philadelphia Department of Prisons per year. That's the prisons that are, the jails that are on State Road. The community effects of incarceration are obviously and indeed devastating, because most of the persons, since there is this disproportionate number of persons of color, they come from impoverished communities, where even before incarceration, chronic and infectious diseases, drug abuse, and other physical and mental stressors are present at much higher rates than in the general population. That lends to health care in these communities that tend to be poor or non-existent. Being incarcerated only serves to exacerbate these problems and or create new ones. The contagious health effects of incarceration on the already unstable, impoverished communities is creating monumental, catastrophic devastation on our communities. So I want to talk a little bit about women and incarceration, because often they are the forgotten population. We talk so much about men and statistics and information that pertains to men that I wanted to take a moment to talk about women and incarceration and some of the specifics that concern women. They're often the invisible population, the forgotten, unmet needs, neglected, and overlooked. Currently, there are 219,000 women behind bars in America, according to the Prison Policy Initiative, many of whom are mothers and victims of domestic abuse. And many of these women are in jail for killing men, excuse me, and had been battered by those men. Yet women who have committed such crimes typically average 15-year sentences. In contrast, their male counterparts, who are less likely to use a weapon, are given more lenient sentences of between 2 and 6 years. 80% of women in jails are mothers, and incarceration can lead to isolation and trauma for children left behind. Even worse, many states still shackle women during labor and even while giving birth. The statistics now for children of incarcerated parents are 2.7 million children have a parent who is incarcerated currently. Often the criminal justice system and the tools created for criminal justice overlook women because of their smaller numbers, in addition to their gendered policies that erase women's experiences. And so this is just a graph that's showing a breakdown of where the women are and how they're incarcerated according to the crime or alleged crime that was done. As I was doing some further research, I learned that a great percentage of the women are in jail on very low bails of release amount. Women are on local jails at a longer time awaiting trial because they can't afford the bail amount to get out while they await trial. More than 2/3 of incarcerated women in America reported having a history of mental health problems, which is a far higher percentage than their male counterparts, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And although, again, women only make up 7% of the prison population, 66% reported having this history of mental disorder, almost twice the percentage of men in prison. And 1 in 5 women in prison had recently experienced serious psychological distress, while 1 in 7 men had. So if we're talking about the impact of health on our communities and families when one is released from incarceration, absolutely, certainly, we have to consider the health consequences of persons who are incarcerated. And so if this trauma, this health illness begins before incarceration, it is only magnified and indeed exacerbated while being in prison. And so that effect on the individual, of course, in and of itself is devastating. But when they're coming out, remember, 80% of them are mothers. This trauma, this devastation, this mental illness, if not handled, is now going to affect, obviously, everyone who they come in contact with, so namely their children. So the children are already devastated by the fact that they've lost their mother or father to incarceration, and they're dealing with their own sets of trauma related to that, as well as related to living in impoverished communities. And so it is important, again, that we are really addressing and talking about the health to include mental health in the same tier as we are talking about physical health. Across the country, 86% of incarcerated women have experienced sexual violence. 86% of incarcerated women have experienced sexual violence. 77% have experienced partner violence, and 60% have experienced caregiver violence. The criminal justice system practices and policies are often not designed specifically for women who are minority among incarcerated individuals. The high rate of trauma among incarcerated women creates the need for a multitude of resources and support services. However, as we spoke about earlier, jails are ill-equipped to address the challenges women face when they enter the justice system. Frequently, these challenges are exacerbated when they leave the criminal justice system. And so I wanted to briefly talk about just a few of the traumas experienced by women. And so some of that is receiving a limited amount of feminine hygiene products, and or they have to pay for the feminine hygiene products during their menstrual cycle. And so that looks like they only get 1 pad a day or 2 pads a day and or tampons. And so they have to find a way to be able to get basic human needs met. That's a travesty. They also, in some states, are still shackled and restrained during pregnancy up to and including during delivery. And although Cory Booker passed the Dignity Act, or there's a Dignity Act bill currently in New Jersey, and we are working in one in Philadelphia for basic dignity for women, these things still continue to happen. And from my own personal experience, some time ago, over 20 years ago, I was a correctional officer in a women's facility in New Jersey. And I remember specifically being I was a transit officer this particular day, and she was about to give birth, and we were ordered, she had to be handcuffed to the bed. I was much younger then, but it was devastating for me. I could not imagine, where is she going? She's about to give birth. Why are we doing this? And so if this continues to happen, that level of trauma, so the trauma of being incarcerated, then the trauma of having to deliver a child that you're going to be separated from in most cases, and now I'm shackled to a bed. And so it is incumbent upon us, the society, to be active about changing current policies that are affecting women in such high magnitude. We're going to talk a little bit about health and incarceration. Despite high rates of reported acute and chronic illnesses, healthcare delivery is inappropriate, inconsistent, and scarcely meets needs with serious consequences of the incarcerated person. And again, I speak from personal experience of watching how this happens. And of course, this is not a broad brush that this happens in every institution, but my experience from personally being in the jail on that level, as on other levels, have seen the lack of consistent and appropriate health care. One study by Harvard Medical School and the Cambridge Health Alliance suggests prisoners are 55% more likely than the general population to have diabetes, 90% more likely to have suffered a heart attack. There are documented increasingly rising numbers of HIV and AIDS and hepatitis C cases in prisons and jails. And our organization here at FIGHT, we have a HIV, AIDS, and a hepatitis C program that we are in the jails, and it's linkage to care, so that we are identifying folks who are living with HIV and AIDS and hepatitis C, and ensuring that they are linked to care while both incarcerated as well as when they are released. According to American Journal of Public Health, 43% of inmates in federal prisons and 39% in state prisons suffer from chronic medical conditions, such as hypertension, high cholesterol, diabetes, and obesity, all of which contribute to cardiovascular disease, the leading cause of death in the United States. And most of these diseases are, again, in high numbers with persons of color. Prison and jails shoulder a disproportionate burden of chronic health conditions. Again, we spoke about some of those already, and we're going to include mental illnesses, untreated and undertreated illnesses as well. In a study of mortality rates after release from prison, it was found that released prisoners were 12 times more likely to die in the 2 weeks following discharge than the general population. 12 times. And this graph is just showing a depiction of deaths per 100,000 person and the years. And so if you look at the bottom for the weeks after release, for weeks 1 through 2, you can see the large surge with 2,589 persons. You can see the large surge during that 2 weeks that they spoke about. And then it goes down, obviously, to not, lower the 3 to 4 years, but it still remains at a pretty high number, 900, 614, 708, and 725. Those are still high numbers from persons coming from out of incarceration. So just as in a baseball game when they have the 7th inning stretch, I have included a slide for home stretch because a lot of the information that we are receiving is indeed or can be stressful and distressful. And so that we can just take a temperature check, take a moment to breathe, we're going to take a 1-minute pause so that we can do that, and then we'll pick up for the remainder of the webinar. Thank you. Okay, we're going to talk a bit about post-incarceration syndrome, and I'll refer to it as PICS as we move on. PICS is a set of symptoms that are present in many currently incarcerated and recently released prisoners that are caused by being subjected to prolonged incarceration in environments of punishment with few opportunities for education, job training, or rehabilitation. The symptoms are most severe in prisoners prolonged to solitary confinement and severe institutional abuse. The severity of symptoms is related to the level of coping skills prior to incarceration. And so, again, if we go back to what's happening in these impoverished communities of color prior to incarceration, being incarcerated is only exacerbating any existing condition. So the length of incarceration, the restrictiveness of the incarceration environment, the number of severity of institutional episodes of abuse, the number and duration of episodes of solitary confinement, which we all know is inhumane and should be banned in every prison in America and elsewhere, and the degree of involvement in education, vocational, and rehabilitation programs. Some symptoms of PIC. The first one is institutionalized personality traits resulting from the common deprivation of incarceration, a chronic state of learned helplessness in the face of prison authorities, and antisocial defenses in dealing with predatory inmate environment. Number 2, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. So that's both from pre-incarceration trauma and trauma experienced within the institution. I spoke somewhere not too long ago, and we were talking about post-traumatic stress disorder and how that is so prevalent in, again, impoverished communities. And the community members are walking around not even realizing that they have trauma. And so if you're waking up to gunshots every day, hearing gunshot noises every day, if you're waking up to this state of poverty daily, if you're going to school and you're concerned about your safety daily, you're experiencing trauma. And so if you think about that in context in terms of from both pre-incarceration and then the trauma within the institution, that is magnified. Antisocial personality traits developed as a coping response to institutional abuse and predatory prisoner environment. Social sensory deprivation syndrome caused by prolonged exposure to solitary confinement that radically resists social contact and sensory stimulation. Now, just from working here at the Institute for Community Justice, where we do reentry services, we have had the opportunity, gratefully and thankfully, to service some of the juvenile lifers that have been released, thankfully again, and as well as other persons who have been incarcerated for over 10 years or more. And what I have found is that just being around a lot of people is very overwhelming. And so one instance, for example, when I think it was either the first or second juvenile lifer that had come to ICJ specifically, and we have this particular policy, or not policy, that's kind of deep, but procedure that happens when someone comes home from incarceration. So all of us kind of gather and go into the room and welcome home and give them their welcome home package and just welcoming them back into the community. And so one time, I just wasn't thinking, I was just so elated for this person to be home after serving 42 years in incarceration. And so the employee that was servicing him called me, and so I gathered everybody and we go into this room, and he was clearly overwhelmed. And so in my head, I knew better, but my heart condition was different. And so that was a great learning tool and learning experience for me in how to successfully navigate when someone, particularly who has been incarcerated for such a large amount of time, comes into our building or into our department. And so if we put that into smaller bites, when that person goes home into the community, or that would probably be larger bites, goes into the community. So they haven't been to Philadelphia for a very long time or to any city for a very long time, and they're coming back. Things have changed tremendously. And so just being around these groups, large groups of people, is traumatic and can continue to be traumatic. And so that is one of the symptoms of PIC. And the fifth one is substance use disorders caused by the use of alcohol and other drugs to manage or respace the PIC symptoms. Now, clearly, and we know that there is ability to get drugs in prison, so that doesn't stop, and that's just a reality. And so often folk come out with an addiction. They may or may not go in with one, but certainly we have to admit and understand that folk often come out with an addiction. Why should we be concerned about post-incarceration syndrome? According to the Prison Policy Initiative, every year, 626,000 people walk out of prison gates. The effects of releasing this number of prisoners with psychiatric damage from prolonged incarceration can have a number of devastating impacts upon American society. But more specifically, since Black persons are incarcerated at a disproportionate rate, the devastation is much more impactful on communities of color. Individuals with PICS are at a high risk for developing substance dependence, relapsing to substance dependence use if they were previously addicted, relapsing to active mental illness if they were previously mentally ill, and returning to a life of aggression, violence, and crime. They are also at a high risk of chronic unemployment and homelessness. Okay, that one was a flipsies. Okay, barriers to successful linkage to care post-incarceration. So experiencing PICS obviously is a barrier to a successful linkage to care. Incarceration obviously is a traumatic experience with profound impact on how the individual interacts with structures on the outside, especially if those structures are perceived to be unsafe. This can create generational trauma that can be linked to outcomes such as our historical distrust of health institutions. Black persons more likely to use ER instead of primary care physician. They're less likely to disclose on full medical history. And stigma, why are they less likely? Because of stigma. There's a lot of deep-seated fear and concern that Black lives don't matter, and that the medical community really will harm people of African descent on purpose, just for profit or just to help someone from another race. And that as well is deep-seated. If you think about the troubled racial history, and one example is the Tuskegee study, which involved doctors letting Black men die from syphilis. Another example is the case of Henrietta Lacks, who was a poor African-American woman whose cancer cells scientists and drug companies used for decades without her permission. And the list of abuses is long of this distrust historically with persons of color and healthcare. And the stigma of just being incarcerated. And so oftentimes the healthcare providers provide services in a way that is not conducive to persons who have been incarcerated. And so this whole stigma is attached to it, as they're not very well, I would say, versed in how to provide care to people who have been impacted by mass incarceration. And one shameless plug, at Philadelphia Fight specifically, I have witnessed the way how our physicians are able to successfully engage and provide the medical assistance and support needed specifically for this population. In conclusion, there's a direct correlation between mass incarceration and poor health. There is also a direct correlation between race and disproportionate representation within the criminal justice system. These two jarring and undeniable premises have convinced me of the following conclusion. There is one often overlooked byproduct of mass incarceration that is devastating the African American community. And by that byproduct is the physical and mental well-being of our community is under siege. For many obvious reasons, people in prison are among the unhealthiest members of society. Again, coming from these impoverished communities where chronic and infectious disease, drug abuse, and other physical and mental stressors are. And so the experience of being locked up, which often involves dangerous overcrowding and inconsistent or inadequate health care, exacerbate these problems, and they're coming out into the community. Trauma-informed care. Individuals returning back to their communities from prison must receive support services in a trauma-informed care environment. In short, trauma-informed services are provided from a perspective of what happened to you as opposed to what's wrong with you. It is my belief that only through receiving trauma-informed care, both while incarcerated as well as upon release, that individuals, families, and communities can begin the healing process. According to the Vera Institute, better health outcomes depend on giving newly released inmates a real chance to find jobs and housing. A real chance. So when I say a real chance, again, because of the field that I work in, I understand that although we are grateful and appreciative for the employers who agreed to employ persons with a felony conviction, we need jobs that are real life-sustaining jobs, which definitely aid in assisting the recidivism because they're sustaining. They can sustain themselves and their family. Further, we need to end laws that keep punishing people after they have been released from prison, like denying public housing and food stamps to those with drug felony convictions. It's like a person is released from incarceration, but the residual just keeps reverberating. It just keeps reverberating. And so the person, it's difficult for them to, in fact, re-enter successfully. Lastly, public health and criminal justice systems must communicate effectively with one another. This requires comprehensive electronic health records that can be shared among agencies, increasing the likelihood that those who leave prison with health problems will not fall through the cracks. So oftentimes when folk are released and they come here and we take them to the primary care physician, they may not know what their health issues are. They may not know what type of medication that they're on. And so the time that it takes to do the background, to get the information, there is precious time lost of the continuity of receiving their medication. So there has to be an increased system, a better system, in which the prisons and the jails are speaking with organizations on the reentry side. Before I get into what we do at the Institute for Community Justice, I want to say that the overwhelming majority of inmates will be released from prison after serving their sentences. And so far, the nation has struggled with how to help them re-enter society. Generally, released prisoners must return to the county where they last lived, which for most means returning to a poor and socially isolated inner city neighborhood or community. The unprecedented numbers now being released have compounded the problem. And so, again, particularly in Philadelphia, where we have this new district attorney, and the numbers of folks coming out is obviously a wonderful thing. But these numbers, we have to have the proper re-entry services to support the numbers that are being released. Many prisoners enter the system with drugs, alcohol, or mental problems. And in the vast majority of instances, they have received little or no treatment or counseling during their incarceration because of reduced funding for rehabilitation programs, such as closing or scaling back of state mental facilities. Prisons and even jails have become the dumping grounds of necessity for those who have mental health issues. On another level, general health care within prisons, including mental health care, has been woefully, sorrowfully, embarrassingly inadequate, resulting in a number of lawsuits against both federal and state correction systems. Unfortunately, this means that prisoners released back in their old communities return no better off, or in many instances, worse off than they were before being incarcerated. Allowed to continued unreformed mass incarceration will shape our nation in ways that should repulse anyone who values the correlated concepts of freedom and redemption. Unless we consider mass incarceration a moral and policy failure, it will splinter already fragile families and communities. This will ultimately hurt our entire nation. Again, I am Asada Thomas. I thank you for listening to this webinar today. I am the director at the Institute for Community Justice, a program of Philadelphia Fight, and we are a reentry program. On this slide, you will see some of the services that we currently offer here at the Institute for Community Justice. And this last slide will show you other programs that we have. One of the things that I find really profound about ICJ, specifically as a reentry program, is that healthcare, jobs, and housing were the top three concerns when folk are released from incarceration. And so, in that order. And so at the Institute for Community Justice, since we are a program of Philadelphia Fight, we are connected to federally qualified healthcare systems to include a dental practice and a pediatric and adolescent center as well. And so at ICJ, we're on one floor, we have the health center, John Bell Health Center on the next floor, dentistry on the next, and pediatric on another. And so while they are getting the reentry support services at ICJ, we are able to link them to these other places for their health care. We also have Diana Baldwin and Tree, which deals specifically with the mental aspect for individuals. I just want to say thank you specifically to Kyle and Dr. Tashina Reeder and Jamil Johnson, one of my staff persons who, without him, this could not have happened. So thank you all so very much.
Thank you, Asada. This was amazing.